the slides that are in the slide set on weeds, I kind of outline what I want you to know, and then you can use the textbook as backup. All of it is in the textbook as well, but so combine what you see in the PowerPoints. It's pretty straightforward things on just, what is a weed and then what are ways to control it. And this was kind of some of the newer methods that I was looking at where you can do it at your own home. If the one on the top right, you have to like plug in, so you can't get very far unless I suppose you have a massive extension cord, but it's like a high power hair dryer in a way. So it's pretty environmentally friendly in that regard. It's not herbicide that you're applying, and it's around your house. If you have pets or kids, this might be a strategy. They do say sometimes you have to do it more than once, but it's just essentially a blast of hot air to the above ground portion, and they call it a weed burner. And you might have to do it more than once, but it does work. And then the one on the bottom, that bottom picture, that's you can use a propane tank on a cart that you can wheel around. So you don't need an extension cord. That actually uses fire. So you got to know what you're doing and do it at the time when you're not going to cause a forest fire or any kind of issues, but live flame certainly can do the job of killing weeds. And so that one is propane gas. And then I mentioned the equipment now that they're selling that actually is for field-based commercial crop where you have weeds in the field, and that it's electrical zapping essentially. So instead of a bug zapper, it's a weed zapper, and they actually sell the attachments to go onto your tractor to provide the electricity. So I thought that was pretty wild and actually kind of a great idea. I don't know how much this is in use. I have not noticed it myself when I've driven by fields, but I don't know. I think it's a great alternative to all the herbicides that have been dumped into the soil systems over the years. And then this is really new in the sense of, can we actually use this in real life? So this is the idea of sound waves, applying sound waves to plants. And so in this particular paper, they talked about a couple of ideas. One was this could be used for weed control. And so what they found in their study was that when they applied the sound vibration, it caused the stomata on the leaves to open up. And then they could spray the weeds with herbicide. And especially now that the stomata are wide open, the herbicide gets in better. And they didn't have to use as much herbicide under those conditions, which is great. That's a great idea. And so this is just one strategy to more effectively get the herbicide exactly where you want it. And because it's more precise, they didn't have to use as much. So I thought that was a great idea. And sound waves, that's a pretty innocuous method to apply. In the same paper, they were also saying that you could use sound waves in other ways too. And so if you think about the non-weeds, like the crops you're trying to grow, again, hitting them with sound vibration, causing the stomata to open, then you could add fertilizer. You could do foliar spray of fertilizer, and that would be, again, a more precise way to get the fertilizer in. And there's some intriguing studies that are showing that it can improve the plant immune system, that you have better plant defenses when you apply sound waves to the plants and then challenge them with different pathogens. And so some of the control was modest, but some was pretty significant. And so they're saying that these sound waves could reduce the requirement for as much herbicide and pesticide and things like that, as well as boosting the immune system. So this is pretty new information and thoughts on how we could use these types of stimulation, I guess, to help the plant. And so there's a company in Japan that has made a sound wave generator, so to speak, that they can just like put out in the crop fields and turn it on. And it has these sound waves that will go out and affect the plant. So you may see or hear more about this as you live your life and hear about how they're growing crops and trying to help the plant. Okay, so some of the more cutting edge stuff going on. Okay, and let me switch into the other slide set on controlled environment agriculture. So that's another topic I wanted to get into. So my plan is to talk to you a little bit about that starting today, controlled environment ag. And then I also still wanted to talk to you a little bit about plant growth and how the plant is affected by the environment in terms of its growth and development. And so it kind of goes hand in hand in some respects with controlled environment, at least the topics I'm going to focus on. And again, I don't have time for huge in-depth. It's going to be more of an introduction. Oops, let me go back to Zoom here, do a reshare. Okay, so controlled environment agriculture. So this lower left image is when I first got hired here, there was a geodesic dome that was connected to the science building, kind of like where, you know, where that round entrance is, the science building. There was a little walkway that was encased. It was all like plexiglass, short little walkway that led into a geodesic dome, and that was the greenhouse. So when I got hired, they're like, "Here's your greenhouse." And I'm just like, "Oh my gosh." So luckily, when I got hired, when I was actually interviewing for the position, that's when they said they were building a real greenhouse. And that's the main reason why I kept interviewing here. It's like, okay, but I kept saying to everybody, so this is like a done deal, right? We're really going to get a greenhouse. And they're like, yes. And so I kept asking that of everyone just to make sure that I wasn't getting fibbed to. But so this is an amused greenhouse. We're in the research side right here doing some research in a plant phase lab. But yeah, so big improvement from this little, this isn't actually the picture from it. I grabbed it off the internet. I couldn't find an actual archive picture of the little greenhouse here, but here, I mean, it looks nice to have it in your backyard. It's kind of nice. I mean, sure, but not for doing research and more larger projects. So when they talk about controlled environment ag, they typically, a lot of people immediately think about greenhouses, and that's certainly true. But we have also expanded that idea. It's not just the greenhouse industry that we're thinking about. We're thinking about repurposing buildings. So this is something that is happening in some larger cities like Chicago, for example, and New York, where they're just using like warehouses, abandoned warehouses, turning them into indoor growing facilities. So they're not a greenhouse; they're just a building that they've repurposed. But let's get into the greenhouse a little bit first, because some of the jobs that you may end up getting, you'll be working in a greenhouse. And so they've started off, they've been around a long time, and as the materials have improved, they have been getting better and better. But basically, you provide a way to allow light in, and the roofs are slanted because you want the winter sunlight. You know, winter sunlight's a little bit more lower angle in the sky, so you're trying to get the best winter sunlight captured as best you can. But in the summer, that the slanted roofs help kind of not get too direct of the summer sun. And so it's just a nice design to make sure you get enough winter sun, not too much summer sun, essentially. And depending on who built it, you could go with glass or acrylic or polycarbonate. There's all kinds of materials that you could think of. You could be single or double pane. So the greenhouse here on campus is single paned, unfortunately. It was designed as double paned initially on the blueprints. I have proof. It was supposed to be double pane. And then they had budget issues during construction. So somebody had the brilliant idea to change a double pane greenhouse in the latitude of approximately 46, 47 degrees latitude to change it from a double pane, which is way more good at conserving heat in the winter, to single pane. So now, yes, it cut down on the building costs, but now every winter they pay for it in spades because now you have the heating costs to deal with the single pane greenhouse. So boy, did they make a mistake on that. And of course, they didn't consult anyone in biology or any of the plant biologists. They made that executive decision. So here on the left, you see the more of the greenhouse style. The two other pictures are more of the hoop house idea, what we currently call hoop houses, high tunnels, some people call that. And those are often polyethylene because they're flexible and can be stretched around these poles that are in the half moon shape. And so we basically you want the greenhouse to be able to hold heat, but also release it. And so you have to have a way to do both and control that process as best you can. You probably know we have a hoop house here down by the Jacob Eddy complex, and that has been up and running now for many, many years. And it's amazing how well that allows us to extend the growing season this far north. It really is impressive. And this is a pretty basic hoop house. It's not nearly as sophisticated as some others I've seen, but it certainly can get the job done in terms of extending the growing season well into, I think some years they're going into December, sometimes even January, and then they can start up in February and March in some years. So it's really amazing. When you think about normal growing seasons here in Marquette, when I have my garden going out back, what is it? The end of May, hopefully, if you're lucky, you can get plants in there at the end of May, and then you're harvesting in August, September. You don't have a very long growing season this far north. So, okay, so what do you have to do? Well, certainly temperature, you have to be able to control that in the summer, but even in the winter, cooling is a problem or an issue, I should say, that you have to keep in mind. And so in our greenhouse, we have a shade cloth that is like a curtain on the roof that is automated, and it's on rollers, essentially, or pulley system. So it can automatically close over the roof to shade out if things are getting a little too hot in the greenhouse. Misting would be another strategy. So the upper right picture, you can install misting systems. Unfortunately, we didn't have that in the blueprint. That was pretty expensive back then. But you can always aftermarket install misting systems. I had my grad student do that for quite a while. We had a misting system that was going okay in the teaching side and in the research side. So you can do that after the fact. Our greenhouse has a roof vent. So right at the peak of the vent, or the roof, there is a small pane of glass that runs the whole length that can open and close at the peak. And we have it where, you can just open it, 10% or all the way open. And so that right at the peak, like that lower right picture that's trying to show that idea where you have this small section of glass that can open up right at the peak. And so that's a good strategy just to allow like the hot air to rise and come out of the greenhouse. And then the other idea that's a little bit more proactive, I guess, are to have side vents on the side of the walls of the greenhouse. And on opposite sides of the wall, you have a couple of things going on here. So here, this lower left picture, you see all this brown stuff. That is what is a large part of what we call a swamp cooler. And swamp coolers are like efficient, low-cost way to do air conditioning, if you want to think of it that way. And so what it is you have all of that brown stuff is essentially cellulose. It's made out of cellulose, so it can absorb water really well. It's kind of like a sponge, and it's in a honeycomb design, so it has good surface area. And there's a big reservoir of water with a pump in it that will pump water through this membrane, this evaporative pad, so it gets all wet. And so now that it's nice and wet, what you do is you have windows right behind it that will open up to the outdoor air. And so now outdoor air, maybe it's a hot, July day, it's 90 degrees, but that outdoor air will come in and go through that wetted evaporative pad and start cooling immediately because of that. And then on the other side of the greenhouse, opposite this pad, you have very strong exhaust fans that will turn on, and then it'll suck the air through that evaporative pad all the way across the greenhouse and out the other side. And so really it's pretty low tech when you think about it. It's just a special pad that gets wetted by cold water in a tank, a reservoir tank, and then get some air blowing through it or coming through it. And so it works really well. The evaporative pads do have to get replaced. They get kind of aged and old, and so you do have to replace those every handful of years. But other than that, it's pretty low tech. And so that is a common strategy in the greenhouse industry. They call it in swamp coolers. Here's another name for it that I talk about. This is a mock-up of that idea where you have the cooling pad and then you have the windows behind the pad bringing in the air, and then the pretty aggressive exhaust fans sucking the air across. And so it works really well. So cooling is certainly a thing to think about. Around here, we have heating to think about in the winter. And so in our greenhouse, we do have heating systems. And so the upper right picture, that's one of our unit heaters, we call it. They're up high in the greenhouse. We have one in each greenhouse room. And it's fed by the heating system in the science building. So it's tapped into that. So it's hot water system that comes from the science building into the greenhouse. And then we get the blowers blowing the hot air. And then this lower picture kind of in the middle, we don't have that. This is awesome though. It's a great idea. It's an infrared heating system. And so those work by heating objects and not the air. It's really odd because has anyone taken an infrared sauna? That's my best experience with infrared, because there was a infrared sauna that I got the opportunity to try, and I'm used to regular saunas where the air heats up. This one, you walk into the sauna and the air just feels like regular ambient air. It feels like room temp. And then you turn on the infrared heater and sit there, and within minutes, your body's heating up. It's really kind of freaky. But you sweat just like a normal sauna. I mean, you get the temperature, to the point where you experience the same kind of payoff as a typical sauna. So this is what this does. It'll heat the plants and the soil, but the air, when you're walking around in that greenhouse, the air just feels like regular ambient air. So I've never actually been in a greenhouse that runs this way, but I bet there's a lot of savings on heating if you can design it correctly. So I think it's a great idea. I'm not seeing any greenhouses myself that are doing this currently, but they're out there. And then you can do bottom heating. You can do it on the bench where the pots that the plants sit on you have a heating system right on the bench, or you can do it even on the floor. Some plants are directly just put on the floor in the greenhouse, and you can have floor heating, like kind of similar to what they do in homes for floor heating. It's similar. So one of the issues we have in the winter is that on a sunny day, no clouds, but it's really cold outside. Let's say it's 20 degrees out, but it's a full-on sunny day. The greenhouse can pop up into the high 90s on those days. And so the problem is in the winter, you have to turn off the swamp cooler because it's water flow in pipes. You don't want the pipes to freeze and burst. So you have to shut down the swamp cooler. So that's not an option now. So the only way we can cool the greenhouses in the winter this far north, at least our greenhouse, is to open the roof vent and just passively allow hot air to float up and out. Every once in a while, I'll resort to turning on those powerful exhaust fans, and that can help. But the problem is, if you open up the side window behind the evaporative pad, turn on the exhaust fans, what you have happening is it's like 95 degrees in the greenhouse, and all of a sudden you draw in very forcefully 20-degree air. Do you think the plants are going to like that? That's terrible for the plants. And so when we're running experiments, especially when students are running their experiments, I hate to do that because it messes. It's a variable that they didn't anticipate. So it's a real problem, and I'm complaining to facilities about this. We need to figure out a way to somehow mitigate the heating up in the greenhouse during the winter. I know the spot cooler is not an option because that's water pipes. You can't have those running because they'll freeze at night. So this would be an option that I'm trying to convince them. So with, well, we already have horizontal airflow fans. We have those. Those are just like regular fans that are mounted up high and they circulate the air, and that can help. Like turn those on, and but if it's 90 degrees in there and it takes a long time, even with just the roof vent open, it takes a long time to get it manageable heat in there. Not to, you know, it takes a while to come down. So, but it can be very useful, those horizontal airflow fans, because it just circulates the air. It really helps mix up the air close to the leaves. It keeps humidity down by the leaves, so there's not too much disease pressure. If you know you don't want too humid for too long, because then fungi can gain an upper hand. But I'm trying to convince them of this convection tube idea. So that's this lower image, and I don't think it would be that expensive, at least based on what I see here, where it's just a plastic funnel, essentially. You attach one side to a fan, and the other side is attached at the other end. And then you take, so that would allow the cold air in through that tube. And then you have holes that are manufactured in the sides and bottom, but not too many. So that as that cold air is brought into the convection tube, it'll get forced out those small holes. And so it's a much slower introduction of cold air, and it helps mix a little bit better the cold air to the hot air. And so I think this would be a pretty good strategy for our greenhouse that shouldn't break the bank. They shouldn't get too upset about the price on this. Again, it's just plastic. You just have to have a way to attach it to a blower and then just close it off on the other end. And so that's one idea that I think would be pretty straightforward. You might have, if you've been in our greenhouse at all, I know you've been, those of you in lab have been in there. If you're in the research side and you look at the far wall, kind of out where the dumpsters are out in that alcove, that far wall has been, they have like this, I can't remember what they call it, but it's like an applique that you apply to the windows to kind of partially shade the windows. That's the hardest. The research side gets really hot compared to the teaching side because of the angle of the sun in the winter. It'll beam through that side of the greenhouse. And so they kind of put that partially shaded material that you can just stick right to the window. And that's helped. It's not, I think, like if we could add in the convection tube, that would really make a difference. So again, not terribly expensive ideas, but the overall goal is to create the right temperatures that you want for your plant growth. And then to be aware that your temperatures can strongly influence plant growth and development, both the daytime temp and the nighttime temp. And so when you're growing crops, you know, commercial crops in a greenhouse, you need to kind of get to know your plants and understand how are they impacted by day and night temperatures. And so just some examples here with, if you're going for plants where you want beautiful green foliage, like you're selling plants to businesses, buildings, or malls where you want a landscape indoor, you know, plants and you just want beautiful green foliage, or a lot of orchids, you would do this kind of situation where you have 29 degrees Celsius during the daytime temps and drop it to 21 at night. I'm not asking you to memorize these numbers. I'm just trying to get you to think about the idea that you can manipulate day versus night temps, and that can have a strong influence on the plant growth and development. When they grow roses, chrysanthemums, azaleas, they try to do daytime temperature, they drop even more, down to 17. Like they'll do like a 29 during the day and drop to 17. And so you get to know that with getting to know your plants, like what impacts them, and then you can manipulate that. And then if you're not too you don't really care how tall that your plants are growing, that's not really an issue, because height can really be affected by the day night. But if you're not too concerned about that, then one strategy that's commonly done is that you put your day temperature about 5 degrees higher than night on a cloudy day. And then on a sunny day, put it about 10 to 15 degrees. And again, I'm not asking you to memorize these. I'm just trying to get you to think about the idea that you can really manipulate how the plant looks and its overall growth and development by messing with the day and night temperatures. Okay, so it's not just the day we got to worry about. We have to also think about the night. Okay, so I'll talk to you a little bit more about this in the next slide set when we get into plant growth and development, how they respond to their environment. So this can be hard to do, especially on sunny days in a greenhouse, just because temperatures soar and then your nighttime temperatures can plummet depending on where you are and the time of the season. So it's gotten a lot better with the digital or the computer control systems that are in play, and a little bit more sophistication on how to cool and warm your greenhouse, heat and cool. So it's gotten better. So if you're growing a plant where you're like, yeah, I don't want it too tall, then you can figure that out usually by messing with the temperature. So they've defined it, they often give this DIF, D-I-F, acronym, which stands for the difference in the average day versus night temperature. And so again, the difference between the two seems to make a big difference. And so if you have a positive day temperature, that means the day temperature is higher than the night temperature, that actually stimulates stem elongation. If you do the reverse and actually put your day temperature lower than your night temperature, you can get restriction in stem elongation. So again, depends on what you're going for. Like some plants you want nice and compact, like poinsettias. That's, you're starting to see poinsettias now in stores. We prefer poinsettias that are very compact so that all the flowers are very close to each other and it looks very visually pleasing. If you grow, I've grown poinsettias under non-commercial growing conditions. They get very leggy and they don't look as pleasing when you look at them. And so just doing this kind of manipulation can really make a difference. And the greater the difference between day and night temperatures, the more pronounced your effect you're going to get, either positive or negative on stem height. So this is a pretty simple strategy as long as you have a good greenhouse with good control systems where you feel like you can confidently really hit the right temperatures for both day and night. Okay, I'll talk a little bit more about temperature in the next slide set, but let me shift over a little bit to light. I'm going to be talking about light again too, because that, of course, can profoundly influence plants. So when we say light quality, we're one way to think about it is color. Like what color of the visible or the visible spectrum do we have? And the fancy word is spectral composition, but that term has not caught on. But a lot of people will use that. It just hasn't really come into our vernacular very much. But basically, we're looking at the different wavelengths of sunlight energy coming from the sun. And there's different wavelengths that will be emitted by the sun. And so we can pick up on certain wavelengths and others we can't pick up on just because of how our retina has evolved in visual acuity. So of course with plants, they have particular wavelengths of light that they've evolved to maximally absorb. So they're really good at absorbing certain wavelengths over others. And that's going to be really good for photosynthesis, for example. So we know that red and blue light is really good for photosynthesis. And so that's roughly 650 nanometers is red light, roughly 440 nanometers wavelength is for blue light. And so those, when you hit a plant with red and blue light, their pigments, their chlorophyll pigments, maximally absorb. They just really love those qualities of light, and they'll really absorb that and use it for photosynthesis. Now, for plant shape, as you're trying to design the plant that you want and how you want it to look, you can see the use of different qualities of light can get you there. So you could use red. Blue's been used a fair bit. Far red. Far red, by the way, is roughly 700 to 800 nanometers. And so playing with light can also get you to influence the overall shape and height of the plant that you're working with. Then we also have light intensity, which is really the quantity, how much light is hitting the plant. Are we in very dim conditions where the light is barely there? Is it super bright? Light intensity where your eyes are squinting. And so again, intensity of light can be absolutely critical for the plant, because if it's too dim, a lot of plants can't efficiently do photosynthesis. If it's too bright, on the other hand, it can cause damage to the plant, just like we can get damaged by sunlight energy that's a little too intense. And so from the plant's perspective, the light intensity, we think about this idea called photosynthetic active radiation. They abbreviate that down to PAR, P-A-R, PAR. And so the photosynthetically active radiation, they're just saying that's the wavelengths of light that the plant's using that's coming from the sun. Like, they don't use everything. They use certain qualities. And so they'll talk about that. And there has to be a certain intensity of it. All right. And then duration is another idea. How long are the plants exposed to light? And it's actually what the plant is doing is it's assessing how long am I in the light? And then it's also saying, how long am I in the dark? And it's actually assessing both of those and deciding how to grow and develop based on that. So I'll be talking to you about that more as we look at how plants respond to their environment. But certainly in an indoor environment, even in the greenhouse, you can control this to a good extent, because certainly in a greenhouse, yes, you have sunlight energy, but you can extend the amount of sunlight by putting in artificial light, right? So we have that in our greenhouse. So, and then if you're in a totally indoor environment, you have a lot of control on exactly how much light that plant is going to get. Okay, so how long does that light hit the plant? How long is that going to happen? Well, that controls what they call photoperiodic response. That's the thing to do. To basically say that how long light is hitting the plant, it's going to influence the plant growth and development. Absolutely. And so photoperiodic just means light period. You know, how long is it being exposed? And so if you combine light duration with light intensity, then they start using the acronym DLI, daily light interval. And so if you see that term anywhere, what they're really doing is they're thinking about duration, how long is the light, and also how bright is the light. They're doing both. Okay, so you might see those types of measurements being taken. And if you look at the units, it's actually moles of quantum energy per day. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just trying to get you familiar with this term. And so when you do this, you can measure it in the greenhouse. You know, you can actually measure that and come up with values. And most greenhouses usually get, you know, less than 25 to 30 moles per day. And if it's a cloudy day, it's going to be quite a bit less. But you can measure that. There are tools out there and you can do that. And Now, if it gets too low, then it's good to measure this, because if it gets too low, then you can program the lights, artificial lights to come on and supplement. And so this is something that they are assessing. And the fancier greenhouses that are computer controlled, they can do all of this. There's sensors in there that will spit these values out to you, and you can even remotely, like from the greenhouse here, I can access what's going on from my house. I don't have to come to campus to figure out what to do or what's going on. I can just do it from my house. So that's nice. All right, so definitely working with light in a controlled environment when you can influence the plant growth and development. And so if, for example, for red and blue light, hitting them with the right duration of that and intensity, you can make sure that your plant is staying compact. It's not getting too leggy, too tall. And sometimes that's what you're going for. And you can end up, if you do it right, with plants that are compact, nicely branched, lovely green leaves, which is what you might be going for if you're growing plants for landscaping, indoor landscaping, outdoor landscaping. Far red light, for example, you can expose plants to that, and it actually gets them to increase their stem length. And I'll explain to you why in the next slide. But there's a definite reason why they're doing that, and it's actually a very logical response by the plant. But these are strategies that you can use when you're indoors growing. And so if you do this, if you hit the plant with far red light, they'll grow tall. They don't branch as much, and they do tend to have leaves that are not quite so green. They're not yellowish. They don't look thick, but they're just not as deeply green. And one thing to be aware of is you need to understand that light can impact your plant shape, growth, development. And if you crowd your plants in the greenhouse, you could be creating problems for yourself. Very often what tends to happen is people will crowd their greenhouse because they want to grow lots of plants to make a profit. But then what that does is it actually causes shading, which causes far red light to hit more plants. I'll explain why in the next slide set. But basically, crowding leads to more plants getting far red light. And if you don't want tall, fewer branch plants, well, you're going to get it if you crowd. So you have to be careful. Crowding does impact who gets what quality of light. Okay, and so you need to make sure that everything, if you're going for compact plants, you want things nicely spaced out so that the light energy is hitting every plant pretty much the same, and they'll all get adequate access to the red and blue light. Okay, light quantity, how much light? Then you can measure this using the photosynthetic photon flux, PPF. And then sometimes some people use PPFD also as a measurement, which is PPFD is just looking at the area, the physical area that light energy is striking. And so you can buy light meters. The ones that we currently just purchased in the biology department measure PPF. And this is the best way really to measure, because it's from the plant's perspective, what's the best quality of light and quantity of light. And so it spits out a value that is measured in micromole per second per meter squared. And really, this is what we care about when we're growing plants. So you have to appreciate our eyes are not the same way that plants care about light. They want certain qualities of light to do photosynthesis, for example, and then certain qualities of light definitely influence their shape and behavior even. And so basically it's the photosynthetic photon flux is essentially, that's the light that the plant is really caring about. And you will see that within reason, if you increase the PPF's value, get higher and higher values, you'll get an increase in photosynthesis to a point. Too much of anything can be bad. Eventually you're going to hit a plateau or even cause damage. So there's a line you don't want to cross. And so for photosynthesis, I typically see this in a lot of readings, that solar light is best, but I put that in quotes because I think it depends. But you'll see this a lot where people will say solar light is best for growing plants. And then, although they will admit that there's plants out there that you can grow entirely under artificial light. And then there are some that say it's best for this plant to do solar, like in a greenhouse where sunlight energy is coming in, but then you augment with artificial light as well. And so it depends on your plant that you're thinking about, how you want to work with this. Do you want to use sunlight and have a greenhouse situation? Or can you go entirely indoors where there is no windows, nothing, and you just do all artificial? Okay, so it really is crop dependent how you want to do that. Okay. So what's happening when a plant is getting hit with different intensity or quality of light? So here you're seeing two images of a cross section of leaves. And when you grow plants in full sunlight, you tend to see leaves that are like the top image here, where you can see how much thicker it is compared to the bottom. So plants that are in full sun, like throughout the most of the day, they're getting full on sun. They're not getting shaded out by anything. You will see that they will, the sun leaves will get thicker, but smaller in surface area. Okay, thicker, but smaller in surface area. If you actually go in and like look internally under the microscope, you would see that even the cell numbers change, of course, because of the changing in the shape. And you'll see also that the stems will elongate in shape. The stems get thinner as well in the shade. And so it's usually much more dramatic. Like you can usually pick out a sun leaf versus a shade leaf. So with a shade leaf, if a leaf spends most of its time in the shade, so if you, even on one tree, for example, on one plant, you can have sun and shade leaves. It's not like a plant does one or the other. So if you think about like a maple tree with a good, nice canopy, the upper leaves will be sun leaves because those get consistently exposed to sun. Some of the leaves in the lower branches will be more like that bottom picture, shade leaves. Shade leaves are thinner, so they're physically thinner, and they're also bigger in surface area, so that they kind of spread out, so to speak, to try to capture some of the sunlight on the edges of their canopy. And so they're just trying to kind of hedge their bets and make themselves bigger in surface area to capture whatever sunlight they can get access to. They also see a difference in stomata. How many stomata might be on the leaf surface? That can vary. And you see a shade avoidance response, which is a big deal for plants. And so I'll talk about this a little bit more, but it's really important when you grow plants closely together, or if you look at forested ecosystems where you have a lot of dense plant growth. Shade avoidance is the idea that plants can tell if they're getting shaded. And if they're the type of plant that needs more sun, they're going to try to avoid being shaded. And so they actually have physical responses to being shaded out. Now, some plants are adapted to shade, and then they don't really exhibit much of a shade avoidance response because they're like, I'm all right with shade then. I'm adapted to that. But if you think about plants that have to be in brighter sun or sun for longer periods of time to be successful, to create, finish their life cycle, they do a very particular set of responses it's quite sophisticated, and it's called the shade avoidance response. So I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the next slide set. But basically looking at manipulating light intensity and its wavelength you're definitely influencing photosynthesis. You're definitely influencing hormone production. Plants produce reactive oxygen species that kick into gear under different stresses. So using light, you can stress the plant in a way that will kick up their reactive oxygen species. And that can be a good thing for the plant, but it can also be a bad thing because reactive oxygen species are essentially free radicals. And I think you've learned through your life so far that it's not good for us to have a bunch of free radicals in our body, right? It's the same thing for plants. Having a bunch of free radicals, not a good thing. But under certain conditions, reactive oxygen species actually can be really useful for the plant, especially when they're defending themselves against pathogens. But they also use it in a good way against abiotic stress, like too much light or something like that. Okay, we'll stop there and we'll get into more, a little bit more of this on Monday.